Good evening, everyone. A big welcome back to all of you who have been with us for our previous webinars. And tonight, I am happy to welcome those of you who are joining us for the first time. I noticed on the registration page that we have some faculty from a high school in the St. Louis area, St. Teresa. So welcome to the faculty there. My name is Maria Pascuzzi. I am the director of Spirit Alive, which is a new ministerial outreach supported by the Sisters of St. Joseph of Brentwood, New York. We welcome all of you and are very glad that you could be with us tonight. Tonight's webinar, entitled Loving Beyond the Limits of Culture and Nationality, is concerned with the phenomenon of global migration and the Church's teaching, which is meant to guide us in our response to the immigrant other. Not only the immigrant at the border, but the immigrant in our midst. As we sit in our homes tonight, thousands of Syrian, Iraqi, and Afghani migrants are hungry and freezing, stuck at the border between Belarus and Poland, pawns in a political power struggle between these two countries. The same type of humanitarian crisis is playing out across the globe. Most recently, at our southern border, we have seen a flood of Haitians fleeing fresh experiences of both political instability and natural disasters. Continuous corruption, poverty, violence, and natural disasters have long spurred migration. And for most Haitians at the US-Mexico border, their arrival is the culmination of a years-long journey. There is a ballooning migration crisis across Latin America, bringing to our border millions of our neighbors fleeing extreme violence, political instability, and poverty. More and more, we are seeing environmental migrants, that is, people whose home environments have become inhospitable to life because of increased drought, desertification, sea level rise, and the disruption that we've already experienced ourselves of seasonal weather patterns. As the world experiences global human migration on an unprecedented scale, according to the World Migration Report for 2020, there are approximately 281 million international migrants in the world, and it's growing. In the face of that, we must ask, what do we do? How should we respond? How do we respond to the immigrant other in our midst, to the immigrant at our border? Tonight, we are here to better understand the issues and to consider a response, not guided by political expediency, but one rooted in the gospel and in our call to holiness and in the teaching of the Church. Pope Francis, in an apostolic exhortation entitled Rejoice and Be Glad, that was issued in 2018, made it clear that Christians must care for the poor, the sick, and the immigrant just as much as they care about preventing abortion. He outlined two responses to the poor and the immigrant. And here I just want to paraphrase paragraph 98. He said, we can see the poor and the immigrant as an annoyance, a problem for politicians to sort out, or even pieces of garbage cluttering our public spaces. Or we can respond with faith and charity and see in the poor and in the immigrant a human being with a dignity identical to our own, a creature infinitely loved by God and an image of God, a brother or sister redeemed by Jesus Christ. Tonight, we're here to listen and learn about the plight of the immigrant other and to be informed by the Church's social teaching. Most importantly, we are here to open ourselves to God's Spirit alive among us, the Spirit of renewal and transformation who awakens in us the fire of God's love so that we might love as God loves, beyond the limits of nationality and ethnicity. And now it's my pleasure and an honor to introduce Professor Michelle Pistone, a woman steeped in the gospel and in Catholic social teaching, who has dedicated almost the entirety of her professional career to the plight of immigrants. Michelle is a professor of law at Villanova University, where she has taught since 1999. I met her while attending the Vista program, an award-winning program which she created and recently launched at Villanova to train immigrant advocates. While at Villanova, she also founded the law school's in-house clinical program and founded and directed the Clinic for Asylum, Refugee, and Immigrant Services, known as CARES. Michelle is the author of numerous books and articles, including publications on immigration viewed through the lens of Catholic social teaching. She serves as an expert advisor to the permanent mission of the Holy See to the United Nations on human rights. When I sent an email to Michelle to ask her if she could recommend someone to join us for tonight's webinar on immigration and Catholic social teaching, I wasn't sure I would get a response. But not only did she respond, she responded by volunteering. She's certainly proof of that old adage that when you want something done, ask a busy person. Michelle is a local. She grew up in Manhasset Hills, and though she lives in Villanova, Pennsylvania, she considers herself a New Yorker. Welcome, Michelle. Welcome.
To be here.
Thank you. Before Michelle addresses you, we thought it would be helpful if we all heard some stories from just a few of the millions of people who, for a variety of reasons, are caught up in the phenomenon of global migration. So I invite you now to sit back with us and listen in.
We, in the past, migrants were quite content to stay where they were on their land and farm. And, you know, I still, of every 5 migrants that I meet, 4 of them would have preferred to stay where they were at home. But they've become victims of global economic trends that are really beyond their control. It's no longer possible for them to stay where they are because they simply cannot feed their families.
Sí, sueldo del trabajador. El trabajo ya no vale. Sí. Y sí, trabajamos duro en el campo, de sol a sol. Sí. Y ya no podemos hacer algo, no se hace nada, pues. Sí. No progresamos en el futuro. Tengo mi esposa, tengo 3 niños y mi mamá, que yo la cuido, por eso yo voy decidido, pues, si en el camino me toca morir, pero estoy arriesgándome, pues. Sí.
We continue to engage in economic policies that are not helping people stay in their country. To the contrary, we've engaged in the North American Free Trade Agreement with Mexico that in fact has exacerbated the migration problem. Instead of solving the problem as the politicians promised the public it would, in fact it has created more and more displacement of workers in Mexico. If they can't produce corn and make a living off the corn because we have flooded their market with cheap corn, what do we expect them to do?
Detrás de ese problema hay todo un contexto social que lo acompaña. Y ese contexto social es el que hay que entenderlo y hay que comprenderlo.
This border is the best laboratory in the whole world for looking at what's happening everywhere on the globe. This border is unique. It's the only place on the face of the earth where the third world directly adjoins the first world, where you can walk in one step from the third world to the first world and back.
This is Ricardo. He and his friend are at the border for their first time. Both Ricardo and his friend are from Chiapas, the southernmost state in Mexico, and one of the most economically depressed areas in the country. Their destination is North Carolina. In about 2 hours, they will head into the desert and begin their attempt to cross the border.
Yo, esa es mi idea, esa es mi meta. Tengo 3 todavía niños que voy a sacarlos adelante. Sí. Y por eso es que me preocupo en irme. para allá, arriesgando, pues, porque arriesgan su vida, porque a lo mejor por ahí un rinche o alguien acaba, ya ni se comunica uno para la familia, ya ni ellos saben dónde se quedó uno, porque así pasa, ¿no? En todos los demás compañeros que han venido se ha pasado, vienen y ya no se comunican, es que ya no existen, por ahí se quedan tirados. Ese es el riesgo que nosotros llevamos, ¿no? Pero uno vamos adelante, como decíamos anoche, que vamos adelante, siempre con el frente adelante y con la meta de que va uno a llegar a ser algo.
Ramon is also from Chiapas. He has a college degree and has left behind a wife and children.
21, ¿no? Sábado 21 de abril, Altar Sonora. Demasiado caro, unos cuartos hacinados, 6, 7 personas en un cuartito más. ¿Cómo es? Unas camas literas de madera, una sábana, todo. Tenemos que dormir en el suelo, la comida cara, lo poquito que tenemos en efectivo, no lo acabamos de sábado a lunes.
Esa es mi idea, de ir a hacer algo para los hijos, ¿no? Sí. Para que no, ellos cuando estén más grandes no vayan a estar igual que nosotros, sufriendo peligro aquí, porque no está viendo la vida de los hijos después, si es igual que uno o ellos agarran otros vicios, pero no. Es mi idea, trabajar para mis hijos, no para uno, porque uno sufre por allá.
Ahorita de aquí estamos haciendo algo, pero estamos viendo cómo pasar para allá. Y es lo único que estamos haciendo de hoy a mañana. Estamos viendo cómo vamos a pasar y ojalá que sí les llegue suerte.
Si no le sigue uno, camina uno 3, 4 noches en veces para llegar. Sí. Y si a medio lo agarran, entonces se retachan otra vez para atrás y volver a intentar otra vez hacerlo mismo. Porque es lo que más se camina. Pues de día casi no camina uno ahora porque está muy delicado pues, con la ley de día. Se perdieron esa esperanza que uno tiene. Sí. Pero ojalá, primero Dios, de que no vaya a ser así, que intente uno y de una vez la haga uno para ya empezar a trabajar allá.
I met with a woman about a year and a half ago in Altar one night who had a couple of kids with her. And somebody in my delegation said, "Don't you understand the risk you're taking? You've got a couple of, kids who are just above toddler age, and you could die out there." And she looked that woman right in the face, and she said, "Look, I've got 2 choices. I can risk everything and go for broke and maybe win a future for my kids, or I can stay at home where I was and watch them die a slow death." If that's the choice that these people are going to confront, it doesn't matter what we do to the border to try and stop them. They're going to keep trying to come the same way you would, or I would, or anybody in North Carolina would.
Que permitan, pues, o sea, eso es incontrolable. Y el gobierno de Estados Unidos, siento yo que lo reconoce hasta cierto punto, que es incontrolable el paso. O sea, por más zanjas, por más barreras, muros, ¿sí? El muro de la tortilla, el muro de la vergüenza, como le quieran llamar, por más vigilancia, siempre van a estar enfermos.
And so we are connected, and our stuff is being built. Everything that sustains us is coming from people all over the world. And in most of those instances, those people cannot feed their families on what they're being paid to create our consumer items. That's going to be the primary challenge of our time. Your lifetime and mine, if we're smart, is going to be absorbed in the question of how we're going to create a just global community.
Siento que América debe de abrir un poco más sus fronteras no solo en cuanto al comercio exterior, sino también debe abrir sus fronteras para el trabajo. Si se pidió un tratado de libre comercio, un ALCA, ¿cómo le llaman ustedes? Pues caray, pues también deberían haber incluido el capítulo del trabajo, pero no.
We've entered into a free trade and economic trade agreement with a country that really has little power against the United States. And so we got a trade agreement that is more unilaterally beneficial to not to you and I either, to the multinational corporations in this country. and less beneficial for all workers here, and much more less beneficial for the Mexican worker. And so it's time, we can't wait any longer. We have to begin with looking at the root problem, and in the meantime, we have to have border policies that respect human life, that are orderly, that don't have the effect of militarizing our borders.
Entonces, yo le digo a la gente, a los americanos, que nosotros no somos perros. Nosotros no somos gente de segundo. Desgraciadamente vivimos en un país pobre y cada vez se está empobreciendo más, producto de un presupuesto gubernamental tremendo y que más se destina para el pago de una deuda que para subsanar necesidades de la gente. Venimos de un país donde nosotros quisiéramos pues vivir bien, y crean, pónganse la mano en el corazón y entiendan esto, que si nosotros estuviéramos bien aquí en México, si nosotros viviéramos bien aquí en México, si las condiciones de vida fueran aceptables, créanme, no tendríamos nada que venir a hacer esto.
Wow. That was really a very powerful plea to Americans. A very humbling experience to listen to these stories. But maybe before we begin our conversation, Michelle, you can help all of us who are committed to the gospel to understand how Catholic social teaching should inform our response to immigrants and their plights. So, Michelle, I'd like to turn the webinar over to you now before we begin our conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, so that that video, I think, is so moving because it represents a lot of the stories that I've heard from my clients over the years. So as you mentioned, I've been a law professor at Villanova for now more than 20 years. And over that time, my law students and I have provided free legal representation to asylum seekers and immigrants, really from all over the world. Many of them came from Central America, South America, but equally from Africa, from Asia. And the stories are all very similar to the stories that we heard in that video. And I feel like one of the core principles of Catholic social teaching, and what we're hearing a lot, especially from Pope Francis, is the importance of creating a culture of encounter, which is for us to hear the stories and start to understand the plight of migrants from their perspective. And I feel like that video was a great way for us to start this session because it responds to Pope Francis's call for all of us to engage in this culture of encounter. Because it's so easy to look at the numbers and forget that we're talking about individual people and to forget their human dignity. And so I feel like that video really helps in that way. So what I wanted to do for the next few minutes is just kind of set out a few of the principles in Catholic social thinking about migration, and answer three of the key questions with respect to migration. One is, who can migrate? The second is, where can they migrate? And the third is, how should migrants be treated when they arrive in a receiving country? And Catholic social thought talks about all three of those questions and gives us some guidance in terms of how we as Catholics can think about who should be migrating, where they can migrate, how they're treated in the receiving country. So with respect to that first question about who can migrate, in Catholic social thought, there are three groups of people that Catholic social thought talks about when they talk about who can migrate. One category is refugees. The second category is ordinary migrants. And the third category is skilled and highly skilled and educated migrants. And within Catholic social thought, the teachings talk about each of those three groups differently. So let me start with talking a little bit about refugees. So the first group, refugees, Catholic social thought endows a very strong right to migrate for refugees. The US and the Mexican bishops, for example, explained in 2003 in a joint pastoral letter between the bishops in both countries that the right to migrate must never be denied when people's lives are truly threatened in their homeland. So when we think about refugees, under US law and international law, refugees are defined as people who have either suffered past persecution or have a well-founded fear of future persecution on account of one of five grounds, their race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. So under US law, people are refugees if they've either suffered past persecution or they have a well-founded fear of persecution on account of one of those five grounds. And that's both in international law and in US domestic law. But in Catholic social teaching, the definition of refugee is even broader than that. So in the church thinks about considers people as refugees if they're fleeing conditions beyond just race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a social group. For example, a refugee under Catholic social thought would be someone who's compelled to flee from their home country because of natural disaster, or climate change, or famine, or severe economic deprivation, or war. So in other words, in Catholic social thought, the definition of refugee is even broader than it is under US law. So that's with respect to refugees, that first category. The second category of migrants that is dealt with in Catholic social thought are what we might think of as migrants who are not fleeing dire conditions, who are ordinary migrants. And with respect to this particular class of people, Pope John Paul II said, and I quote, "Man has the right to leave his home country for various motives, and also to return, in order to seek better conditions of life in another country." So we heard a little bit of that in the video that we watched tonight, where we're seeing people who cannot provide for their families in their home country. And so they're leaving their home country so that they can find better conditions of life in another country. So the most common non-emergency reason for people to migrate, of course, is economic reasons. So people can't sustain themselves in their home country. And I think it's also really important for us to understand that Pope Francis's teachings on migration talk about as part of the teachings on migration, he talks about the right to remain in your home country. And we heard that so vividly in the video that we just saw, where people said, if we had a choice, if we could stay in our home country and sustain our families and make a living wage, we would stay. People who are migrating for these economic reasons are doing so because they don't have economic opportunities in their home country. So I think it's really important when we think about Catholic social thought, and really Pope Francis is bringing in this notion of the right to remain in your home country. So part of our duty as a nation, as Catholics, is to think about what we can do to make it possible for people to stay in their home country. And I think the story of the corn is a really great example of how our policies in the United States created conditions in other countries so that people could not remain. We see it also with Iraq, with Afghanistan. We've done things, our country has done things that then make it impossible for people to remain in their home country. And so that's part of our Catholic social teaching. Pope Francis is calling for us to understand that and to realize that the decisions that we're making might impact migration, and that we should think about creating conditions so that people can remain in their home countries. So that's the second category of migrants, ordinary migrants. And the third category that CST addresses, but much more infrequently, is the right of skilled and educated migrants to migrate. This is actually a topic that I wrote a book on Catholic social thought and migration. But I'll only talk about it briefly here. I mean, basically what the social teachings say are that when skilled and educated migrants are leaving, especially when they leave from developing countries and they migrate to developed countries, that's a drain on their home country. And so within Catholic social thought, there's a quote from the Sacred Congregation of Bishops, which is a worldwide group of bishops about 50 years ago, that says that when skilled and educated people are migrating from developing to developed countries, that they could gravely endanger the public good of their home country. Anyway, that describes the three types of migrants: the refugees, the ordinary migrants, and the skilled and educated migrants, with respect to that first question, who can migrate. With respect to the question of where they can migrate, the category of refugees, again, the teaching is very clear, because people who are refugees are fleeing from dire life and death situations, and the church has essentially an absolute position that countries need to accept them. With respect to the second category, ordinary migrants, Catholic social teaching acknowledges that the right to immigrate to a particular country may be more limited than that for refugees. There's a recognition in the literature, of course, that a sovereign nation can regulate migration at its border because of the impact of migration on the receiving country, on their own citizens and residents. Now, of course, under US law, that power exists, and it could be absolute, right? Our government could decide one day to entirely close the border and not allow anyone to come over the border, except, of course, for refugees, because we are signatories to international treaties that require us not to return people to countries in which they would be persecuted. But Catholic social teaching has a different view than that, and it's almost a reverse mirror image view of US legal theory. US legal power in theory excludes everyone and then makes special exceptions to that exclusion. But in Catholic social thought, Catholic social teaching places a high burden on those that would limit migration. I'll quote again from the Sacred Congregation of Bishops here. They say that public authorities unjustly deny the rights of human persons if they block or impede emigration or immigration, except where, quote, this is part of the quote, grave requirements of the common good, considered objectively, demand it. So importantly, this high burden is not met, and here I'm quoting from a joint statement from the US and Mexican bishops, when immigration controls are instituted merely for the purpose of acquiring additional wealth. So let's stop here and think about this, because those quotes have at least 3 limiting principles, right? So we need grave requirements of the common good, considered objectively, and not merely for the purpose of acquiring additional wealth in the receiving country. And so the one place in Catholic social thought where the church has suggested that this high burden can be met is with skilled and educated migrants who are moving from developing countries to developed countries. So that's the second question: where can they migrate? And the limitations that Catholic social teaching puts on that. So the question then is the third question is what does Catholic social thought say about how people should be received when they come to a country, a new country? And this time the answer is very simple, because every category of migrant must be welcomed. In fact, again, Pope Francis, the 4 principles that he talks about when he talks about migration are our duty to welcome, protect, promote, and integrate people into society. So, in effect, everyone who comes to the United States, once they're, or any country, once they've kind of come over the border, they change their category, and in Catholic social thought, they're considered newcomers. And all newcomers across the board are to be treated with dignity and respect. Now, all of these principles, all of these ideas come from 2 kind of core principles within Catholic social thought. And those are the principles of human dignity and the common good. So the Church's most systemic treatment of Catholic social teaching, the Vatican II document Gaudium et Spes, regards human dignity as the grounding of the whole teaching. Human dignity is a sacred gift of creation. Every person possesses it, and it's not dependent on achievement, worth, or value of any kind. So when we think about migrants, again, it's so important to look beyond the numbers and to remind ourselves that these are individual people who are working to protect or provide for themselves, their family members, their friends. And so the other foundational principle in Catholic social thought, of course, is common good. And this principle flows from the communitarian nature of humans. Relationships with family and community are necessary for us to flourish and develop. So with migration, it's really interesting because we need to figure out how these 2 concepts work together. So we get to the question, like, what's community? What community? Is it the good of the receiving country or the good of the sending country, or both? Obviously, there's no scale in which we measure these things in Catholic social teaching. The Church provides us with an orientation, but it doesn't actually answer the questions for us. But it does ask us to come at the questions from a position of increased empathy and understanding. And I think that's the important thing that comes out of this culture of encounter. That when we meet an immigrant, when we work with migrants, we can develop empathy and understanding because of that human connection. I mean, I see it all the time in my students when they come into, my law students, when I'm working with them. And, once they meet a migrant and they hear their stories of the conditions in the home country and the plight and coming to the United States, it just changes my students. And, I've been teaching at Villanova for 20 years, and I'm telling you, like, I still hear from students who I taught like 15, 20 years ago, who email me and tell me that the experience they had in the clinic working with migrants was one of the most life-changing experiences in their whole career. And this is, they've been lawyers for 20 years, and they look back on that experience meeting a migrant and how that was the most, rewarding thing that they've done as a lawyer. It's really remarkable, right? It's touching, of course, as well for me. So, in his encyclical Centesimus Annus, Pope John Paul II provided a model for this sort of approach. And I'll end this part of tonight's event with a quotation from that encyclical. So I'm going to read from the encyclical. Many people do not have the means which would enable them to take their place in an effective and humanly dignified way within a productive system in which work is truly central. We heard that, right? Where these people were, where one of the men were saying, my work isn't valued. They have no possibility of acquiring the basic knowledge that would enable them to express their creativity and develop their potential. They have no way of entering the network of knowledge and intercommunication that would enable them to see their qualities appreciated and utilized. Thus, if not actually exploited, they are in a great extent marginalized. Economic development takes place over their heads, so to speak. Their dignity is not acknowledged in any real way. It is a strict duty of justice and truth not to allow fundamental human needs to remain unsatisfied. It is also necessary to help these needy people to acquire expertise, to enter the circle of exchange, and to develop their skills in order to make the best use of their capabilities. There exists something that is due to man because he is man, by reason of his lofty dignity. And so those are pretty thought-provoking words. And so I know that there's probably a lot of questions. I'll end here, and we can now move on to the next stage of the conversation.
Thanks so much, Michelle. I have so many questions, and I see 15 questions in the Q&A box already. So I'm just going to ask you a couple and then move on to give people time. But one of the things is I want to begin with a question about refugees. I think you mentioned that U.S. and international law obliges countries not to deport someone outside of his or her country if they can't return because of well-grounded fear of persecution. Under the Trump administration, our country seems to have took a very hard line on refugees. I mean, among other things, it used COVID-19 pandemic and loopholes in the law about public health to ban and push refugees back. And long-term incarceration, I mean, shocking really to criminalize refugees who are fleeing persecution, criminalize them and put them in jail. I mean, where are we today with regard to refugees? Have we moved forward in that regard? I mean, it seems like that's a violation of international law.
Yeah, so that question, you packed a lot into that one question.
Sorry.
Good job. But yeah, I mean, I think that there is a crisis in this country in terms of really recognizing our international duties. And in fact, I have some colleagues who are law professors who are suing the United States in like international courts because we're not living up to our international treaty obligations. So you referred to one thing as the health using COVID-19. So there's a provision, Title 42, that allows the federal government to prevent migration into the United States if they think that it would create health concerns. And it's crazy because the Center for Disease Control and many other associations of physicians and medical experts have said that it's not going to be an issue, that like in fact COVID-19 rates were even lower in Mexico than they were in the United States at the time that people were trying to come to the United States. So basically, like you said, it's being used as a way to stop migration, to stop asylum seekers and refugees from coming, but not necessarily aligned with like what experts are saying. It's not really a risk. And we're seeing a lot of people like pushing back. In fact, Harold Koh, who was the former dean of the law school at Yale, was working at the State Department, and he resigned over the issue of Title 42 because he saw the impact on Haitians. And you spoke about, there's so many Haitians who had to flee their home country because of natural disaster and political upheaval, and then came to the United States after traveling for months to get here, and then we're not allowed in because of Title 42. So that's one huge issue. And I think the other thing that you raise is the detention of immigrants and asylum seekers. And frankly, part of it is it's become, because immigration detention has been privatized, it's become a big business. And there are at least two companies, GEO, and Core Civic, that are making money by detaining immigrants. And so they're another thing that my colleagues are finding is that they're actively lobbying Congress so that they can create policies that would create more detention.
Oh, wow.
And I've been a law professor, and I've been working in detention centers for years. I mean, my students and I have represented people in the York County Jail. I've represented people in Maryland and DC. And the conditions are horrible, and a lot of times people are treated as if they're a criminal, even though they're an asylum seeker. It's absolutely, and we also know that there are alternatives that work really well, where people can be living in the community but check in on regular basis. I mean, these things are working. They've had pilot programs, and yet we're still resorting to detention, which, like you said, it makes it look like the person's a criminal, but they're not. They're just fleeing life and death situations.
Well, that's a sad reality, and hopefully things move forward in the Biden administration. I want to move on to the second category, the person who's just the migrant, not a refugee, because I think, maybe I'm wrong, that the average American has a bit more trouble with that category of people on the move who move for economic reasons and who, according to the church, have the right to migrate to support themselves and their families. A number of questions come to mind, maybe some are in the Q&A box, but let me start with this one. How does the church reconcile the right of a country to regulate its borders, which it upholds, and the right of people to migrate? Maybe you could elaborate on that point. I mean, the two things seem antithetical in some way. The church says, yes, a country can uphold its borders, but yes, people have the right to migrate. Put that together for us.
So, I mean, I always go back to this quote from the Sacred Congregation of Bishops that talks about denying the right of that public authorities unjustly deny the right of human persons if they block or impede immigration, except where grave requirements of the common good considered objectively demand it. So we're talking about, I guess, how do we define the common good? And if we think about the common good in the United States, then of course, then another set of bishops, the Mexican and U.S. bishops, said that we can't merely be thinking about acquiring additional wealth, that it really has to be grave conditions considered objectively. And I mean, for those of you who've traveled to other countries, we know that, I mean, that there's so much need, and we saw it in that video. The fact that the free trade agreement actually worsened conditions for people who were before the free trade agreement, they were fine. They were farmers. They were using their land effectively. They were using their skills, their God-given skills to to reap the benefits of their land so that they could provide for their families. And US policies changed the conditions for them, and as a result, forced them to move. And so I think if we're thinking about grave conditions considered objectively, and this fact that we can't do it only to acquire additional wealth, that helps us to understand that maybe that agreement was a mistake, and that next time when we're entering into and we're making decisions that have impacts on other countries, that we think about migration as in considering all the potential impacts of different policy decisions. I mean, I think a great example is the war in Iraq. Like when we, oftentimes when we're entering into war, we don't think about the consequence that, down the line, this is going to produce refugees. And it did. And among the refugees who had to flee Iraq were a lot of Catholic Chaldeans who I represented. And, the Catholic Church, Catholicism was started in that region of the world. And now there's very few Christians and Catholics in that region because they either had to flee or they were killed. And so part of it is kind of recognizing the footprint or the impact that decisions that we're making have on the country, the receiving, the sending countries. Another, like there are so many examples about the Middle East, Guatemala, Honduras, where policies in the U.S. impacted those countries.
Thank you. This is something that comes up, I think, when people think about immigration, especially undocumented immigrants. I think many people believe that undocumented immigrants could have a place in American society if they just got in line and came in legally, as immigrants did throughout the 20th century. Isn't that a reasonable explanation? Can you speak to that? I mean, are they right? Is there a line? Was there always a line? Should people get online?
So there's no line, and there was never really a line. So my last name is Pistone, and my family came from Sicily. My paternal grandfather migrated from Sicily to New York in 1921 at the end of the Great Migration. And I have his papers. I found them, his travel documents. And he didn't have permission to come to the United States. He got on a boat in Naples and took it to New York. And when he got off near Ellis Island, he was processed and invited into the country. So there was no line at that point. Like he came and hoped that he would get admitted, and a lot of people didn't and were sent back. So I think that is a common misperception, that in the past people came legally and that now people are not coming in a legal way. There's never, even from during the Great Migration, there wasn't like a legal way of coming to the United States. With respect to current days, like basically US immigration law has three big categories of people who can migrate in a quote unquote legal way. One is people who are traveling, who are coming here for business. And I would include in that category tourists, students, people who are coming for business. So if people are coming here for business, or they're students or they're tourists, they can get a visa in their home country, or there are some countries in which you don't need a visa to travel to the United States. And, you could either so you're kind of invited in when you get that visa and you're here for a short period of time. So that's one kind of line you can get in. But there's vast parts of the world where it's impossible for you to get a visa from certain countries to come to the United States. The second category of people who can come to the United States are people who are related to either citizens or lawful permanent residents. So that's like family reunification. That would be the second way to come. And there are some countries, again, from which if you're trying to come as a family member of someone from Mexico or from China or from India, you would have to it would take 30 years for your visa number to come up.
Wow.
And then the third category are people who are coming for humanitarian protection. And those are asylum seekers, people who are victims of domestic violence, who have been trafficked to the United States, who would be tortured if they went back to their home country. And there are special laws that allow them, once they're in the United States, to apply for protection.
That's great. Listen, there are so many questions tonight, many more than I've seen. So I feel like I can't hog up your attention. But I just do want to ask you this one last question. My congregation has been asked this week to house a refugee family from Afghanistan, and they will be arriving any day now. We've agreed to do it, and we're able to do it because we have room and resources which we can share. But Michelle, take the average person in the United States who feels motivated to do something on behalf of immigrants and their plight. What do you have a recommendation or two before I launch into the audience's questions?
Yeah, so the Catholic Church is really promoting the concept of immigrant accompaniment, of figuring out ways to encounter the immigrant and accompany them as they integrate into society. And I think that's a great starting point for people. And you could probably engage with your church community or other groups to kind of get associated with immigrants in your community and start helping that way. We met each other because I launched in August a program at Villanova where I'm training people to become immigrant advocates. So under immigration laws, really a lot of people don't know this, but you don't need to be a lawyer in order to provide legal representation to immigrants. And legal representation is one of the most urgent needs in the immigration community today. Like 6 out of every 10 immigrants goes to immigration court without a lawyer. So this, it's called Vista, Villanova Interdisciplinary Immigration Studies Training for Advocates. And it's a certificate program that's online, and it's offered through Villanova's College of Professional Studies. And it's affordable and flexible, and it's a great way for people who are interested in like putting their passion to work to help immigrants. We have students ranging in age from 21 to 86.
Wow.
From 32 states. Yeah, it's been really a great program.
Well, those are possibilities. Thank you. So now let me pull up some of the questions from our audience here. Do you agree with the proposal that immigrant families should receive $450,000 for illegally crossing our border? Is it fair for American citizens to pay for this through taxes? Maybe that refers to payment for to families where parents were separated from their children. I'm assuming that that's what the person means.
Yeah, I'm not very familiar with that provision, but I do understand that it's part of a litigation by ACLU and the government on this family separation issue. It does seem like a huge amount of money, and I'm assuming that over time it will be reduced, because it does like send I mean, it is a hard thing when families are separated, but I think it is a huge amount of money and maybe sends the wrong message about how to prioritize the situation in the United States right now.
Mhm. Why do we speak of the immigrant other? For most of us in the United States, we are all either immigrants or children, grandchildren of immigrants, welcomed by Native Americans. We took what was theirs and treated them terribly. This is just a comment. Let's not repeat the shameful history, but change it. I think we can all applaud that, right? Okay. I think this is an issue, and it was one of the questions I was going to ask. The U.S. pays many of the countries whose citizens are now illegally crossing our borders. Why aren't those countries taking care of their own instead of sending them away?
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge issue. And I can tell you that in some countries, it's just really hard for the government. I mean, Afghanistan is a great example, right? Like, we were there for a long time, left, and then the Taliban like immediately took over. And there's no way
Mhm.
um, for another government to be able to take back control from in Afghanistan. I know that in central in a lot of the countries in the Northern Triangle, like Honduras and Guatemala and El Salvador, that the gangs have become so strong and so pervasive that they've actually infiltrated parts of the government. And so even if so there are a lot of people who aren't able, like the governments aren't functioning because the gangs have gotten like out of control and they're controlling the government. In fact, I've heard of police officers and other people who want to do good in those countries eventually having to flee themselves because the police just couldn't protect them from the gangs. And so, there's just a lot of corruption. And that's one of the problems that leads to people needing to flee. I mean, we saw it in the video, right? They said,
Mhm.
why isn't the government helping us?
Mhm. Um, an anonymous attendee wrote, there is a Black population in this country that is continually sidelined by illegal immigrants. What is our responsibility to American citizens?
I, I guess I don't, I'd love to know more about what you're thinking about that. I mean, we do have of course, a duty to American citizens,
Mhm.
but
Uh,
I don't know that it's like necessarily immigrants against American citizens.
right. Yeah, but I think maybe to follow up on that, I think, Michelle, you hear often that um, immigrants are coming and taking our jobs. And I think there's quite a concern that some people who are not able to advance in society are just now being sidelined or pushed aside by this influx of immigrants. But is it really the case that immigrants who come into the United States are taking American jobs and using American resources that Americans are entitled to?
So, I mean, I guess there's two ways to think about it. In terms of jobs themselves, there is a lot of research saying that say that especially at the low end, that immigrants who come to the United States are actually taking jobs that Americans are not doing. And so that's clear in the research that the jobs that migrants were doing were things that weren't otherwise being done. And you hear that oftentimes in certain industries like landscaping and farming. Like most of the farm workers in the United States are migrants because it's hard to get Americans to do those jobs. Secondly, which is really important to understand, is when migrants work in the United States, they pay taxes into the system, and they usually don't take the benefits. So a lot of migrants are paying taxes during their working years. So first of all, they went to school in their home country, so our tax dollars didn't have to pay for their education. They live in the United States during kind of the prime time when they're working, and then oftentimes return home during retirement age so that they don't get retirement benefits in the United States. So it turns out that there might be, in fact, a net contribution by migrants who are working in the United States into the system.
Mhm. Someone asked, what would be the essential elements of a sane and fair immigration policy on the southern border of the United States?
Well, I mean, the issues on the southern border were really created, I think, um, because there's a lot of migration that was happening, like, over time. Like, over the last 10 years, we've always had a lot of migration over the southern border. In the past, it was mostly, single men. Now that the demographics has changed and there's a lot of family units and a lot of like mothers with children. So I think in order to create a more sane policy, especially when we're talking about families, that we should figure out a way to identify people and maybe give them. There's a technology where people are given ankle bracelets and they have GPS monitoring devices in the ankle bracelets so that we can know where people are, but allow them to at least live without being in detention. I think the detention is it's a huge cost, frankly, for our federal government, but it's also like the costs of detention on children are probably lifelong, right? And if we're thinking about the best interest of a child, it's not good to separate them from their parents. It's also not good to have them living in facilities where their parents can't, like, where their parents don't have control. So they're seeing their parents in these situations where they don't have control, and it's really hard for children to see that and grow up in that kind of an environment. So I think that those are at least two suggestions I would have in terms of creating a more sane system on the border.
Yeah. I'm going to read a question. I think somebody understands that this is what the church thinks and is teaching. I'm not sure that you said it is what the church is teaching or saying, but I'd like you to address it anyway. So the church thinks we should allow anyone in this country, regardless of their criminal records, and allow them to prey on American citizens, and then under some jurisdictions, get out of jail with no cash bail and be able to commit crimes again and again. Why don't we care about our own citizens?
Yeah, I mean, the Catholic Church doesn't say anything about criminals, and I think the grave requirements of the common good considered objectively. I think if we were just to look at that language, the grave requirements of the common good considered objectively, we could say that the church would not expect a country to allow known criminals in because it's not in the interests of the common good, the grave requirements of the common good. Considered objectively, it's not healthy for a society to have criminals in the country or to invite criminals in. So I think, I would just push back on your interpretation of Catholic social thought.
Mm-hmm. Here's another one. So far this year, over 1 million people have migrated to the US for a better life. Unfortunately, we cannot sustain this type of migration. We seem to be concerned about where they are leaving, but not what is happening in America due to illegal migration. Our open border has opened the door to sex trafficking, women being trafficked into a life of horror, children being sexually abused, drugs flowing into our country. Can we really protect ourselves unless we legislate and change the immigration system?
Okay, so that question is, there's a lot in there to talk about. One, right. I think I don't know where you get this statistic about 1 million. That seems much higher than any of the numbers that I've seen. So I would encourage you to go back and see the sources for the quote about 1 million people coming in 1 year. I think one thing to understand about abuse of children and sex trafficking is a lot of that is currently happening at the southern border because of our immigration policies. So because we're preventing people from coming into the country, we're creating and people are now living in cities on the southern border that are among the most dangerous cities in the world. And they're vulnerable because they don't have money. They're vulnerable because they don't know when they're going to get into the United States. They have no places to live. And a lot of women and children living in those conditions are being victimized. And they're being put into sex trafficking, and children are being trafficked as well. And there's a lot of abuse, domestic violence, and other kind of abuse happening in those cities. So I think it's really important that we understand that the policies that we've created at the southern border are creating conditions that lead to increased sex trafficking, increased human suffering, increased levels of domestic violence, and all of that is happening because of US policies.
Okay. And we got time for one last question, one quick answer. In 2018, the United Nations adopted 2 global compacts, one on the safe, orderly, and regular migration, the other on refugees, to address the issues and obligations of both receiving and sending countries. These were voluntary on the part of countries who signed, not obligatory. The US withdrew from participating in both of these compacts and did not sign, although at any future moment they could agree to participate. How hopeful are you that these compacts will make a difference in how the world and the US treats refugees and migrants?
That's a great question. I was actually involved with the Global Compact on Migration because I've been advising the Holy Seas mission to the UN, and we were working on that particular compact because that was a compact that was negotiated in New York. With respect to that compact, I mean, both of them, it was a shame that the US government didn't sign, and hopefully, like you said, they could sign at any time. They are voluntary, but I think it is pretty symbolic when a country like the United States doesn't sign one of, a global compact like that. The Catholic Church was very involved in negotiating those compacts, and has a lot of hope that the compacts will have an impact. In fact, now, 3 years after they were signed, there's going to be a process to review them and see how they're being implemented around the world. And the UN is taking, the Holy See is taking a big role, is playing a big role in that process. So I'm hopeful that that there will be some benefits that come out of it, especially with respect to how people are treated while they're, as migrants in other countries, like having rights to social services, education, etc.
Well, Michelle, it's time to end. There were so many more questions, and I tried to get as many and as diverse types of questions as I could get in. I want to thank you for coming. It's very clear that immigration is a neuralgic issue in the United States, and that opinions are divided about what we should do. We've tried to present tonight what the church teaches and how hopefully it will inform people who are committed to the gospel to approach the question of immigration and the care and concern of people who are forced out of their countries for various reasons. So I can't thank you enough. I want to remind everybody we have another webinar on December 8th. Michelle's conversation tonight is starting a good week for us here in Brentwood. On Saturday, we have Sister Norma Pimentel, who's coming live to Brentwood and will be live streamed. She's going to be here to talk about the spirituality of immigration accompaniment, which is something that Michelle talked about before. So I thank all of you for coming tonight. Special thanks to you, Michelle. I wish everyone a very, very happy Thanksgiving. Be safe, stay well. God bless you, and good night from all of us here at Spirit Alive. Thank you.
Good night. Thank you, everyone.
Good night. Thank you.